The air in the conference room carried a blend of lemon cleaner and the must of aging documents. Someone had pushed the window open too wide, so the breeze persisted in nudging the blinds as if seeking entry. I found my place at the far end of the table, next to a carafe of water that no one bothered with. Directly opposite me sat my younger brother, Owen Fielding, 31, clean-shaven, and dressed in a pricey-looking suit that didn't quite fit him right. I caught sight of myself in the blank television screen and fussed with my tie as if I was prepping for a job interview. My parents, Diane and Robert Fielding, stood beside Owen. Both were in their mid-60s, wearing an air of fatigue in their expressions, though they appeared put together for the day. My mother kept giving Owen's hand light, reassuring pats. My father barely spoke, just as he never did when he wasn't calling the shots. At the top of the table, Percival Donnelly, my grandmother Lillian Chin's estate lawyer, stood, older than either of my parents, with hair the color of polished silver swept neatly back and a voice that sounded like gravel softened under the sun. He had known Lillian Chin for more than 40 years and often said she was the only client who ever pointed out mistakes in my grammar. This day was the formal reading of the will. Lillian Chin, my grandmother, had died 3 weeks earlier. She was 80 years old, reserved, exceptionally smart, and remarkably thrifty. She was the sort of person who clipped coupons, wore sweaters from 1995, and somehow managed to pay my entire university fees in full without once telling my parents. Our whole family believed the house and whatever savings remained would be left to Owen. He was assumed to need it the most. That's how it had always been told in our family. Percival Donnelly recited the legal opening with a deliberate, well-trained rhythm. The next words, however, left us breathless. To my grandson, I bequeath my main home on Laurel Avenue, my 2008 Honda Accord, and the funds contained in my investment account, ending in 9170. My mother let out a breath as though she had been holding it in for days. Owen just gave a small, relieved grin, not at all gloating. He leaned back a bit, as if the universe had finally shown him a little kindness. Now it was my chance. Percival Donnelly adjusted his spectacles. To my granddaughter, Ivy Hart Fielding, he announced, then paused, much too long. I bequeath $1 and all my lasting affection. That was all. No follow-up, no explanation, no exceptions. Someone laughed a little too loudly for it to be natural. I suspect it was one of my cousins joining via Zoom. Or it could have been Owen. I didn't bother to check. My mother quietly made a sound of dismissal and again patted Owen's arm. She insisted she never required much, speaking just clearly enough for everyone to catch it. No one glanced my way. Percival continued reading the legal sections, some clause relating to the patio chairs. My attention wandered. I fixated on the single paperclip clipped to the folder in front of me. Gold-tinted, exactly the style my grandmother always bought in large packages. When our meeting concluded, my younger brother Owen clasped Percival Donnelly's hand as if receiving a well-earned promotion. My father expressed his appreciation to him. My mother wanted to know where the paperwork for the deed would be mailed. I rose from my seat and left before anyone could go through the motions of saying goodbye. Outside, the wind was stronger now. The clouds had turned that gentle gray that comes just before the rain begins. In my purse, I still kept the thank you card my grandmother had written to me 8 months earlier, creased so often that now the writing was nearly unreadable. Never let them mistake your quiet for not being present, sweetheart. Those who are quiet usually bear the most resonant truths. 4 days went by. I ignored the texts my family sent. Not that there were many to begin with. A single one from my mother, short, "Hope you're not upset. You've always valued your independence so much." That word again. On the 5th morning, I stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal in the kitchen. I was hesitant for a reason I couldn't name when my phone started ringing. The caller ID displayed Percival Donnelly, and the name felt stiff and official. It made me think the conversation would be just as formal. On the third ring, I picked up. "Miss Fielding," he began, then paused to clear his throat. "Ivy, I was wondering if you might come by my office. There's an unrelated issue your grandmother asked me to discuss privately with you." I didn't press for an explanation. There was a short silence as I let too many seconds pass without responding. Then I asked, "What type of issue?" "It's not included in the official will," he replied, explaining that she had given specific instructions. This should only take a brief time. When I visited his office, it felt just as chilly as before. The familiar leather chairs were there, and the same heavy quiet seemed to cling to the room. Percival stood up when I entered, treating me more like my grandmother than her granddaughter. Instead of offering coffee, he simply gestured for me to sit and proceeded to lock the door behind us. The faint click of metal shifting made something stir deep within my chest. I watched as he pulled out a small fireproof envelope from one of the drawers that had been locked. On the outside, my name appeared in my grandmother's handwriting, large, unhurried, and intentional. She instructed him to hand this to me directly, he told me, placing it carefully on the table. And specifically, only if I showed up by myself. I hesitated to pick it up, just looking at it as though it would vanish if I looked away for a moment. "She put this together almost 5 years ago," Percival Donnelly continued, "going over it annually. She never altered a thing." At last I extended my hand to take the envelope. The weight of the paper surprised me. "Take your time," he murmured before quietly leaving the room. He didn't have to add, "Everything will be different now." The quiet was already loud with that meaning. As I carefully broke the seal, I was mindful not to damage my grandmother's script. The envelope held just a single page, all in her handwriting. No erasures, no doubts. I smoothed it open with both hands, as though I were handling something precious. If these words have reached you, then it means I've already let some people down, and I finally confided in the one person who never demanded my trust. For a brief moment, I felt as if my breath had caught. Her voice drifted back to me, not the way it sounded in her last days, but the tone she had when she spoke from our kitchen, one eye checking the stove and the other on the sky. I would always pay attention when others turned away. I never forgot which light switch was finicky. I figured out how to make pie crust by hand, instead of relying on a food processor. I found those memories resurfacing, sunlight streaming in from the side window. My mother taught me the right way to shape the dough without rolling it out too thin. She often reminded me, people hurry up when they don't trust how it will turn out. When I was 23, I relocated to Utrecht. I told my parents that I worked as a translator. What I left unsaid was that I used to translate financial statements for clients who always hid behind aliases. I hesitated, blinking. In her stories, Utrecht was always hazy to me, a place of perpetual snowfall and gentle wool scarves. Early on, I picked up on the fact that the loudest people around money usually squandered it. That's why I took a different tack. I stayed observant. I put my money to work. I maintained discreet accounts. I can almost picture her workspace now, with its lopsidedly worn wood and that old leather-bound ledger I was never allowed to handle. The account at Hartwell Bank, Utrecht, currently contains about 3.7 million. Owen Fielding is listed as the only heir. I paused my reading and let the figure linger, refusing to let it wash over me. I waited. You won't see this sum recorded anywhere in the prior month's reading. It sits in a trust, specifically, the Hartwell Trust, that I set up to exist apart from the rest of the estate. Others wouldn't grasp the purpose. They'd argue I never needed more. But I've seen how I give, even when no one gave anything in return. I've watched myself, slipping away so everyone else could be at ease. A deep breath escaped me. I hadn't realized I was holding it, She had noticed it all, every bit of it, never once needing to say so. You were never unseen, Ivy. It's just that they were looking in the wrong way. Her name came at the end. Lillian Chin, her handwriting unfaltering, still full of dignity. Underneath, there was a final line written gently, as though it came to her at the last second. Let these funds offer others what you always provided. Silently, open a place. I pressed the folds back into the letter. Not that I was finished, but because I wasn't prepared to revisit it yet. The room stayed hushed, deserted, though I no longer felt solitary. The letter was still in my hand as I walked to my car. I chose not to tuck it in my bag. I didn't fold it again. I just kept it resting in my grasp, folded and still, as if her warmth lingered there. My palms pressed together, holding on to that warmth. The sun shone brightly, but the sky looked washed out and featureless. It was the kind of day that made the world seem more distant than it really was. I climbed inside, shut the door behind me, and allowed the quiet to envelop me. There was no music playing, no engine running, only the movement of the air. My fingers came to rest on top of the steering wheel. I didn't shed any tears, at least not immediately. I convinced myself it was just overwhelming and insignificant, that I was all right. Still, grief ignores reason entirely. It arrives in moments when I am most unguarded, when I no longer need to impress anyone or shield myself. I picked up my phone and pulled up my mother's contact. My thumb wavered for a moment above the call icon. Then I set the phone down again. What could I possibly tell her? That the woman everyone viewed as stingy had surpassed them all in dignity and wisdom. That her own daughter, the one who always managed with less, had just come into a fortune beyond what they could have dreamed. No, that wasn't what really stung. What actually hurt was this. On that day, they hadn't even truly seen me. Instead, their eyes slid right over me, barely noticing me at all, as if I were invisible, and I allowed that, at least up until now. 1 month later, I boarded a flight to Utrecht. Nobody was aware. I didn't share any pictures, nor did I message anyone from the airplane. When I arrived, a chill settled into my bones, a kind of coldness that didn't care if I was only passing through. The sky pressed down, heavy and gray, yet the city streets sparkled with an immaculate cleanliness, as if concealing untold stories. My destination was a discreet building on a peaceful avenue, lacking any sign, with only a brass plate labeled Hartwell Bank, Utrecht, so delicately etched that it almost disappeared into the stone facade. Once inside, I was greeted by the aroma of leather mingled with the sharpness of winter. A receptionist, probably in her 60s, welcomed me with a warm smile. Her expression was gentle but knowing, the sort of smile reserved for someone who is holding a secret. She escorted me through a pair of glass doors and along a slim hallway with a spotless carpet. At the end, I entered an office where a man in a dark blue suit sat, his glasses resting at the front of his shirt. His hair was streaked with gray, yet his gaze remained piercing. "Miss Fielding," he said, reaching out his hand, "your grandmother was truly extraordinary." His name was Julien Cartier. Julien had been working alongside my grandmother for almost 30 years. Rather than calling her his client, he explained that she managed her fortune just as a conservator cares for art. Carefully, without arrogance. I took my place in a chair that surely once held her as well. Julien unlocked a leather folio, revealing pristine paperwork, handwritten memos, and investment records that went all the way back to 1993. There was also a sheet titled simply, "The Hartwell Trust," a name inspired by my own middle name. I nodded in agreement, even though this was actually new information to me. Ivy Hart Fielding. That was the name my grandmother had helped my parents choose for me. On the statement, the balance in my account flashed up at me. $46,798 was carefully listed, not a penny unaccounted for. Still, it wasn't the sum that left me breathless. The list of distribution clauses was what took me by surprise. Precise, carefully crafted allocations designed for initiatives such as financial literacy classes for single mothers. Small business loans tailored to help women over 50 make a new start. Emergency aid for those who care for elderly relatives. Next to each provision, Lillian had scribbled a thoughtful remark in her familiar handwriting. Women like me, women like Ivy, women who are often overlooked. I didn't shed any tears. Not right there. Yet something inside me grew gentler. It wasn't a sense of wealth that did it, but finally, a sense of being seen. Julien Caudier regarded me for quite a while. He could have chosen to use the money himself. She might have concealed it. Instead, she trusted in the quiet power of nurturing small things. He shut the folio and eased it in my direction. Now it belongs to you. But she left behind a guide for me. Honestly, I suspect she expected I would stick to it more closely than most others. I stepped out of Hartwell Bank, Utrecht, right before sunset. Utrecht took on a pale golden hue, awash in reflections from the lake. The scent of bread mingled with a mild hint of pine carried on the breeze. I paused at the intersection across from the water, the letter tucked in my coat pocket and the folio stowed in my bag. There were no parties, no glasses of champagne, just the quiet excitement that comes from being given trust. The invitation reached me as a group message. Housewarming for my younger brother. Come see the renovations. No punctuation from my mother. Only emojis and a dropped location pin. I studied the phone's screen for a while before setting it face down on the kitchen counter. Since the prior month's reading, I hadn't been in touch with any of them, but something deep down compelled me to attend. Not to be noticed, but to observe. Owen's new place was still Lillian Chin's old home, with the shutters and porch unchanged. The only difference was the addition of string lights and a wireless speaker beside the entrance. The place was filled with the scent of store-bought candles and reheated snacks. I entered without knocking. At first, nobody seemed to notice me. My mother was by the kitchen island, busy arranging bite-sized cheese portions. My father, holding a glass, was laughing at something Owen said. He appeared lighter somehow. It was the sort of ease that only comes to someone who's handed opportunities they didn't work for. When my mother spotted me, she wore that look of polite surprise people use when they're unsure of your place. Ivy, you're here. How are things going? She used a tone that felt just a touch too cheerful, as if masking something. I replied, busy? She gave a swift nod, not probing further. Then she hit me with her usual line. You've always been so independent. I'm sure you're doing all right. A faint smile crossed my lips. It wasn't a big smile. I dug into my bag and took out a small silver-framed photograph. My grandmother stood outside Hartwell Bank, Utrecht, wearing her familiar gray coat and clutching her handbag the same way she always did for pictures. I set it carefully on the side table, beside the scented candle and a pile of property newsletters. At first, nobody seemed to notice. I stayed silent, refrained from mentioning the Hartwell Trust, left the photograph unexplained, and didn't give any updates, allowing everyone to form their own assumptions. When Owen raised his glass to thank the relatives who had faith in him, I quietly slipped outside. The chill in the air surprised me. It was sharper than I remembered. I zipped up my coat and didn't turn around. My workplace wasn't remarkable. It consisted of 2 small rooms above a laundromat, with a window that stuck during the rain and an unattractive beige carpet that someone had tried to pass off as deliberate. There was a rug on the floor, but my name was written on the door. Lillian Hartwell Capital was named with Chin for Lillian and Hart, from the middle name she had chosen for me, even though my relatives never actually used it. They preferred short, solid names, words they could easily grasp. I never mentioned the business to my parents. It wasn't because of any bitterness. Their worldview simply couldn't accommodate what I was building. Perhaps that was the whole idea. The very first client I advised was a woman named Ruth Salmond, 63, a recent widow just 5 years away from retiring, struggling to keep up with the medical bills left by her husband. When Ruth realized she could keep her car, she wept in my office and told me it was the first time someone had explained a spreadsheet in a way she could understand. My next client was Sylvie Bernard, an ex-waitress who had raised 2 sons by herself and had never managed to open an investment account because, as she put it, what savings did she have? We started with just $25. 8 months later, she had managed to save $250 and described having a peace of mind she hadn't felt since 2000. I didn't document her journey with photos or share any stories about her, and there were no visible transformation posts. None of this was meant to be promotional. What mattered was the quiet transformation that takes place when nobody is demanding evidence from me. I kept my grandmother's letter tucked away in my desk drawer. On days when the cramped quarters or slow-moving progress got to me, I would return to the final lines. May it help women like Ivy, quiet ones who are easily overlooked. The focus had never been solely on the financial side. It was always about providing choices, a little breathing room, and a path to move forward without needing anyone's approval. One evening, after everyone had gone, I found myself at the office window, gazing down as the lights from the laundromat blinked in the darkness. My thoughts went to my grandmother, quietly folding her savings into invisibility. I reflected on how nobody ever questioned why I chose to live my life the way I did, instead making their own assumptions. That, I believe, is the reason she chose me, not because I was in need, but because I recognized her wish not to be seen as someone who needed help. Most people imagine a legacy as something grand and ostentatious. But there are times when legacy appears as patiently walking someone through a spreadsheet, covering a bus fare, or answering a late-night call without casting judgment. Often, legacy is the quiet gesture that earns no applause. And that was all right with me. 12 months went by. The corner of the office rug remained curled. The window continued to jam whenever it rained. But the calendar displayed on the wall was now brimming with entries. Appointments, follow-up visits, and fresh starts filled in lightly at first, then firmly penned as commitments. One Friday afternoon, Ruth Salmon stopped by, handing me a thank you card and a loaf of banana bread. She wore lipstick that didn't quite coordinate with her sweater, and she smiled with the gentle relief of someone who had just learned how to breathe anew. She offered me a piece of paper she had folded carefully. Inside was a letter she had typed. She told me, "This is the email I sent to stop the debt collector's payment setup." It took me 3 attempts before I managed to send it, but eventually, I succeeded. I gave a nod, keeping quiet, and allowed the silence to fill the space. Before departing, she lingered at the entryway. "My grandmother," she commented, "must have been remarkable." My eyes fell on the framed photo set on my desk, displaying my grandmother in front of Hartwell Bank, Utrecht, dressed in her gray coat, gripping her handbag in both hands. "She still is," I replied. That night, after the office had emptied, I retrieved the card my grandmother had given me once, the one I had carried over and over, reading it as I went to the reading of the will, its folds worn soft from use. I went over it again, repeating the sentence softly, this time into the empty room. "Never allow your stillness to be mistaken for not being there, sweetheart. Those who stay quiet often have the boldest truths within them." A grin appeared on my face, and I flicked off the light before securing the door. If you've ever been excluded because others assumed you already had enough, maybe you know what I mean.